includes the community development block grants. The cuts in the House of Representatives will bring this program's funding down to levels we haven't seen since 1975. These cuts alone, if they go through and are enacted into law, will eliminate over 40,000 jobs in the United States. That's the practical impact of this one program and the cuts.
To pay respects to an American hero, Lance Corporal Benjamin Tuttle, who sacrificed his life for this country in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Lance Corporal Tuttle graduated from Gentry High School in Gentry, Arkansas in 2012. His appreciation for athletics kept him active after school as a football player, wrestler, and track runner. As a student, he made his interest in serving in the Marines well known. He shared his love for his country and the Corps during a trip back to his alma mater this last fall. His love of country was coupled with his love for his family. In a Facebook post, he wrote he would be back home in October and was anxious to fish, go to dinner, and just hang out with family and friends. Lance Corporal Tuttle was serving aboard the USS Nimitz. He was assigned to the Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 323, Marine Aircraft Group 11, 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, Marine Corps Air Station, Miramar, California. Lance Corporal Tuttle was only 19 when he gave his life for his country. Mr. President, Lance Corporal Tuttle is a true American hero who made the ultimate sacrifice. I ask my colleagues to keep his family and friends in their thoughts and their prayers. On behalf of a grateful nation, I humbly offer my sincerest gratitude for his patriotism and his selfless service. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And on the floor of the Senate in a quorum call, they are going to be working today on transportation and housing spending, a $54 billion bill for 2014. And later on today, about 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, they've scheduled a procedural vote to move forward on the nomination of James Comey to head up the FBI. While they're in a quorum call here on the Senate floor, we'll take a look at an event from this morning. Army Chief of Staff General Ray Odierno talked about military budget cuts and how that could affect casualties and pay raises in the military. The host of the event was the American Enterprise Institute. And of course, General Odierno is a former commander of Iraq operations. We'll take a look now.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to AEI. Thank you for joining us for our second in our Joint Chiefs of Staff series, a conversation with each of the chiefs. We are so lucky to host General Odierno, Chief of Staff, U.S. Army, this morning, particularly because as chief, he has, depending on the way you look at it, he has very few bosses. Chairman, Deputy Secretary, Secretary of Defense, and the President. Very demanding, but few. Or he has 1.1 million bosses who are talking to him every day. Either way, last week, all his senior bosses were out of town. So this week he's a little busy and needs to get back. So we're grateful for his time and the fact that he carved out an hour to come to AEI and talk with us this morning. We're going to be very casual. We're going to engage with you. My name is Mackenzie Eaglin. I'm a fellow here for National Security. I know General Odierno needs little introduction to most of you. He's the reason you're here, not me. A native of New Jersey, a West Point graduate in 1976. He's a field artillery officer. He's a 38th Chief of Staff. Before he assumed this job, he basically had both senior positions running U.S. forces multinational in Iraq from 2006 to 2010, including the surge of U.S. forces, of which I'm sure he can speak to at length. He's just about hitting his 2-year mark as chief, and I would say now he's more senior and ready to talk about all these issues that at this rare time to be Chief of Staff. He will certainly be a man in the history books. We invite those watching live online to join the conversation with General Odierno. You can reach us through hashtag AEIJCS or hashtag sequestration. Of course, you can just use our handle at AEI or at AEIFDP to reach us with any questions, and we'll try to get them to General Odierno as we can throughout the event. And we'll also be having microphones throughout for you to join us in our conversation. I'm going to kick it off with just a few quick moderator prerogative questions and hopefully get the Chief warmed up for all of you. And we'll just kick it off. I want to start with welcoming the Chief back to the States because he just returned from a trip to India. And this is a country that's had 2 recent visits from other senior officials, including one from China, where the Chinese premier made India his first overseas visit, which speaks volumes, I believe. Then, of course, there was an unofficial visit when Chinese forces crossed into Indian territory earlier this spring. But I think these 2 events encapsulate a lot of what we're watching and seeing from afar in the region. And there's the hope of better relations and peaceful prosperity, but there's also a quiet risk of old-fashioned power politics. So I'd love for the Chief to just talk to us a little bit about his trip and what he saw there, and any thoughts about how he can work with India to advance our policy in Asia.
Well, first, thanks for having me today. I truly appreciate being here and have the opportunity to discuss lots of issues. We probably could spend 8 hours talking about all the issues we're facing today. First, it was my second time in India. The last time I'd been there was about 5 years ago. At that time, I was the military advisor to Secretary Rice. Very different times back then. That was the end of 2005, beginning of 2006. So for me, it was a really important visit. My first visit with my counterpart, General Singh, I had the opportunity to talk to him about a variety of issues. But the one thing we realized is how much we have in common. The 2 largest democracies in the world. We are based on professional armies, two very professional armies, and there's much that we can do together to learn from each other. So we talked a lot about the way ahead in the region, the importance of operations in the region, and then I had a chance. They took me up to their Northern Command, which is their most important command
in our country. Unfortunately, over the past decade, economic growth has been stagnant, creating difficulties for small businesses, for working families, for recent college graduates, and for entrepreneurs. If I have a goal here, it's to make certain that every American has the opportunity to pursue what we all know as the American dream. And for that to be possible, we need a growing economy that accomplishes many things, including creating that opportunity for people to go to work, to pay off their loans, to feed their families, to put food on their family's table, to save for their future. And last month, the Senate had an opportunity to do something positive about our economy. We spent a significant amount of time addressing this issue of immigration, trying to fix our nation's broken immigration system. Sensible and overdue are improvements to our nation's immigration laws that will spur economic growth and create American jobs. That's why I have been so interested to see how highly skilled and entrepreneurial immigrants create jobs and contribute to the U.S. economy. It is that aspect of our nation's broken immigration system that I want to talk about today. There is an economic imperative to improve our nation's immigration laws. Many of our nation's leading businesses struggle to find the talent they need to grow and compete in global markets. According to the Partnership for a New American Economy, American businesses are projected to need an estimated 800,000 workers with advanced STEM degrees by 2018, but will only find 550,000 American graduates with that advanced degree. First and foremost, we must do more to prepare Americans for careers in science and technology and engineering. And I've been encouraged that several immigration proposals before Congress aim to improve STEM education for Americans so that one day we will no longer be required to seek outside labor for meeting our country's needs. But in the short term, we must work to equip Americans with the skills for the 21st century. We also need to create a path for highly skilled foreign students to stay in the United States where their ideas and talents, their intellect can fuel American economic growth. Legislation that I introduced with the Senator from Virginia, Senator Warner, it's called Startup Act 3.0, creates visas for foreign students who graduate from an American university with a master's or PhD degree in science and technology, engineering, or mathematics. These skilled workers would be granted conditional status contingent upon them filling a needed gap in the U.S. workforce. This will help grow American companies to secure the talent they need now for current job openings. And without this help, companies will have to look elsewhere. We'll find it more difficult to find the qualified workers they need and will likely open locations overseas and taking the jobs with them. When I was in Silicon Valley last year, I met with executives at Facebook, and they told me they were ready to hire close to 80 foreign-born but U.S.-educated individuals in California, but their H-1B visas were never granted. Rather than forego these skilled workers, the company hired them anyway. That caught my attention. But the story is they placed them in Dublin, Ireland, not in the United States. Facebook was ultimately able to get visas for these workers after training them in Ireland, but all too often companies end up housing the jobs permanently overseas. When this happens, it's not only those specific jobs that are lost, in this case, we didn't just lose 80 jobs, but also the many supporting jobs and economic activity associated with those jobs. And even more damaging, more damning, more frustrating to me is that many of these highly skilled workers who are now employed in some other country will become entrepreneurs that will start successful businesses there, not in the United States. Those 80 engineers working in Dublin, Ireland for Facebook, I have no doubt but one or more of them will be the next originator, the next innovator for a company like Facebook. And we want them in the United States creating that opportunity here for Americans. Immigrants to the United States have a long history of creating businesses here in our country. Today, 1 in every 10 Americans employed at a privately owned U.S. company works at an immigrant-owned firm. And immigrants are more than twice as likely as native-born Americans to start a business. Of the current Fortune 500 companies, more than 40% were founded by a first or second generation of American. Ranked number 73 on that list, Google, which was co-founded in 1998 by Sergey Brin, an immigrant from Russia. Sergey and his co-founder, Larry Page, developed Google as PhD students while at Stanford University. Google is now the world's top search engine, generates more than $50 billion in revenue annually, and employs tens of thousands. We need to create an immigration system that welcomes more immigrants like Sergey Brin. Our bill, Startup 3.0, creates an entrepreneur's visa for foreign-born entrepreneurs currently in the United States. Those individuals with a good idea, capital, and a willingness to hire Americans would be able to stay in the United States and grow their businesses here. Each immigrant entrepreneur would be required to create jobs for Americans. Providing a way for an immigrant entrepreneur to stay in the United States and create American jobs just makes economic sense. Earlier this year, the Kauffman Foundation, headquartered in Kansas City, studied the economic impact of the entrepreneur's visa in Startup 3.0. Using conservative estimates, the Kauffman Foundation predicts that the entrepreneur's visa alone could generate 500,000 to 1.6 million new jobs during the next 10 years. These are real jobs with real economic impact that could boost GDP, by their estimate, by 1.5% or more. When we talk about economic growth and creating opportunity, a boost in GDP by 1.5%, that's a major accomplishment. Recognizing this potential, several bills create visas for immigrant entrepreneurs. It is important that these visas be structured in a way as to facilitate job creation. Unnecessarily high investment and revenue requirements and burdensome mandates like having to submit a business plan to a Washington, D.C. office, a government office, threatens to diminish the impact these entrepreneurial visas could have. Although well-intentioned, the INVEST visa created in the Senate immigration bill fell prey to some of those traps. To improve that idea, I developed an amendment with the help of entrepreneurs, investors, and startup policy experts. This amendment would reduce paperwork and recording requirements so that entrepreneurs could spend more time building their businesses, allow entrepreneurs to secure initial investment from those closest to them, add flexibility to the way in which startup employees are compensated to account for geographic and industry differences, and clarify that jobs created by immigrant entrepreneurs must be held by Americans. A list of more than 30 startup companies, investors and business leaders, and immigration attorneys supported this amendment. Sadly, like many other amendments, it was blocked from even receiving consideration. But in the end, that may not matter. The Speaker of the House has said that the Senate immigration bill is, quote, dead on arrival. Instead of taking up Senate legislation, the House is pursuing a more perhaps methodical approach to immigration, writing several targeted bills that address aspects of our broken immigration system. Congress crafts better policy when it's done in manageable bite sizes. We do not have to look far, in my view, in the past to see what happens when Congress bites off more than it can chew. Implementation of the Affordable Care Act and Dodd-Frank offer two examples of the unintended consequences of passing giant bills, multi-thousand pages that are poorly understood. In fact, it was 1986 comprehensive immigration bill that left us with so many problems that we're attempting to fix today. Passing a series of smaller, more targeted immigration bills will result in better policy and achieve better results for the American people. Moreover, there is broad agreement within Congress on many aspects of immigration policy. Last year, the House of Representatives passed two immigration bills. One would have repurposed visas from the diversity lottery to STEM visas for some of our most talented foreign-born U.S. graduates. Another would have eliminated the employment-based green card per country cap, allowing American employers to have access to the best talents regardless of where a potential employee was born. This bill passed 389 to 15 in the House. Yet neither received a vote in the Senate because adherence to the approach that says we can't do anything unless we do everything. This line of thinking has prevented progress on important challenges facing our country for a long time. Republicans and Democrats agree that creating opportunities for highly skilled and entrepreneurial immigrants to contribute to our economy is beneficial to America. I strongly hope that Congress will finally come together and pass things that we can agree upon now while continuing to work on the issues that divide us. In my view, we no longer can allow ourselves to be held hostage to the all-or-nothing strategy or wait until after the next election. Right now, other countries are taking advantages of our inability to solve problems and are exploiting our broken immigration system. Since I arrived in the United States Senate in 2011, at least 7 countries have changed their policies and laws to better attract highly skilled and entrepreneurial immigrants. Of those countries, Canada even went so far as to buy billboards in Silicon Valley in an attempt to poach our best and brightest. We must address this problem, and the best way to do so is in a measured, incremental way. The benefits to our nation's economy will be great, and the goodwill produced by working in a bipartisan manner on targeted solutions will sow the seeds of trust necessary to solve the problems where disagreement remains. So we'll see what happens now in the immigration debate, but my hope is that if we're unable to pass so-called broad-based immigration reform, if we're unable to come up with sensible solutions in an understandable legislative package, let us at least work to accomplish those things that there is broad agreement on and continue to work to solve those problems that there remains disagreement today. Mr. President, thank you. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And in the Senate, in a quorum call today, the House is going to be out until tomorrow. Here in the Senate, transportation and housing spending is the topic of the day, $54 billion bill. And later this afternoon, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, the confirmation of FBI Director James Comey. There'll be a procedural vote on that nomination at 5:30. And also pending in the Senate, some executive nominations for the National Labor Relations Board. While they are in a quorum call here on the Senate floor, we'll take a look at something from earlier today. The State Department, Secretary of State John Kerry made a statement that appointed Martin Indyk, a former U.S. ambassador to Israel, as the manager of talks that are going to be underway tonight for the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. New York Times reports that those talks are expected to start tonight over a dinner that's hosted by Senator Kerry. And the negotiating teams will also be meeting tomorrow before heading home. We'll take a look at the statement by Secretary Kerry and also by Martin Indyk.
Hi, Matt. Good morning, everybody. Well, as you all know, it's taken many hours and many trips to make possible the resumption of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And the negotiators are now en route to Washington, even as we speak here. And I will have more to say about the journey to this moment.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to discuss an issue that is vital for the future health and well-being of citizens in our country. That is funding for medical research for the National Institutes of Health. Unfortunately, NIH funding, like many other important federal priorities, is being impacted by the across-the-board spending cuts. As we all know, we want to see that budget go down. We want to see the debt be reduced, but we have to do it in a sensible way, not with a hammer. Sequestration was never intended to be implemented and was supposed to bring Democrats and Republicans together to focus on smart solutions to reducing our debt. I'm a supporter of the work of the Debt Commission. I believe there's a way we can bring down our debt in a significant way, but I don't think we meant to have sequestration implemented in the way it's being implemented and seeing the kind of cuts that we're seeing. These cuts are creating headwinds against short-term economic growth, reducing access to important services, and threatening our nation's leadership in areas like medical research. Congress needs to take a broader, long-term view toward our debt and deficit. That's why I support the Senate budget, which would replace the sequester with targeted spending cuts and additional revenue, reducing the deficit in a balanced way. I know that Senator Murray, who heads up the Budget Committee, has been trying valiantly to get this budget to a conference committee, supported by the Democrats in the Senate and supported by Republicans like Senator McCain and Senator Collins. We have been stopped every step of the way, but this should go through regular order into a conference committee so we can work out these differences with the House and replace sequester with something that makes sense. Today I want to focus on the impacts of sequestration on this particular area of the federal budget, that is medical research. It may not be the first thing that you think of when you think about these cuts and what they mean, but I hope when you listen to my stories today, it brings on a whole new significance. In the last century, we've made enormous strides through medical and scientific research to understand the world around us. This research has led to a greater understanding of the nature and cause of disease and spurred a new generation of therapies and intervention to treat diseases. Our country has been a leader in this era of scientific discovery, and we are responsible for developing many of the innovative therapies and scientific advances that have changed the face of science and given hope to millions of patients across the world. These advancements have been made possible by our commitment to funding research through the National Institutes of Health. Today, the NIH is the largest source of medical research funding in the world. Through its 27 institutes, NIH funds research to prevent, detect, better treat, and even cure fatal and debilitating diseases like cancer, heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, arthritis, diabetes, mental health issues. The institutes also fund basic science, which provides the foundation for future breakthroughs in all fields of scientific discovery. Researchers in my state tell me they can't think of anything they do clinically that wasn't influenced by basic research made possible through NIH funding. Think of the advancements that we've made. These clinical advancements are critical to improving health and saving the lives of millions of Americans. But to truly understand the importance of NIH, Mr. President, I think it's important to understand the impact of our own people. So I want to share just some of the ways that NIH funding has had an influence in my state. On people like Jim from Medina, Minnesota. Jim was 36 when he was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor in 1998. He was a professional engineer. He had an MBA from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management and worked in the family's 56-year-old air conditioning and heating business, Owen Companies, Inc. He had everything to live for, but when Jim was diagnosed, there were almost no treatment options beyond radical surgery and radiation. So Jim looked for other options, and over the course of the next 10 years, he participated in multiple clinical trials and some 7 treatments, all made possible by research grant funding. Jim passed away at age 46, but thanks to the clinical trials, Jim lived over 10 years, allowing his young son, Max, the chance to get to know his dad. He also was able to continue his lifelong athletic endeavors with a ride across the country with Live Strong in 2004 as part of the Tour of Hope, spreading the message of hope and survivorship. But the clinical trials didn't just help Jim. And this is the key part, Mr. President, whether you're from Connecticut or from Minnesota. One of the trials that Jim participated in proved so effective that it is now the standard treatment regimen for people who are diagnosed with the same cancer as Jim. That wouldn't have been possible if Jim hadn't been willing to go through those treatments and if they hadn't been funded by NIH. Then there's Karen. She's a 48-year-old wife, mother of 2 teenagers, and a teacher. She was diagnosed with leukemia in August of 2005. With her type of leukemia, the prognosis is relatively good, and using the current treatments available, she remained in remission until 2009. Then in the summer of 2009, she started feeling sick again and received news that the cancer had returned. Her only treatment option was a bone marrow transplant, which had a 25% mortality rate. So she and her husband visited with specialists and discovered that she had a mutation that didn't respond to the current, at that time, frontline medications. That's when she learned about clinical trials. In January of 2010, she began her clinical trial journey and has now been involved in 2 clinical trials. She responded well to the 2nd clinical trial and has been in remission for over 2 years. Her kids are now 17 and 13, and she and her husband are preparing to send their oldest daughter off to college in the fall of 2014. NIH funding supports the research centers that make these stories like Jim's and Karen's possible. In Minnesota, we have the Paul and Sheila Wellstone Muscular Dystrophy Center, which is supported by NIH funding. The center has 46 faculty members in 7 University of Minnesota colleges and schools and receives $6 million in annual funding from NIH. Together, these scientists are conducting over 10 active clinical research studies that are giving hope to parents and patients with muscular dystrophy. And this facility believes science is more than just about the research. The researchers here have volunteered hundreds of hours helping to educate the people that they serve and ensuring these families have access to support networks. All of this is possible because of federal investment in the NIH. These are inspiring stories, but supporting NIH is important for another reason, meeting the skyrocketing costs of treating chronic diseases. In total today, more than half of Americans are suffering from 1 or more chronic diseases. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, taken together, these chronic diseases cause 7 in 10 deaths and account for about 75% of the $2 trillion we spend on medical care. This year, it's estimated that almost 1.7 million people will be diagnosed with cancer. Almost 600,000 are projected to die from this devastating disease. That's approximately 1,600 people a day. Everyone in this room knows someone who's had cancer or has cancer now. 26 million Americans are living with diabetes, with a new case diagnosed every 30 seconds. And an estimated 5.2 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's disease, and we know this number will escalate rapidly in the coming years as the baby boom generation ages. The growing prevalence of chronic disease, Mr. President, is having an impact not just on Americans' physical health, but on our economy as well. In 2008, cancer cost our country over $200 billion. A recent report on diabetes costs showed that the money spent on diabetes care has risen 41%, from $174 billion to $245 billion in the last 5 years. And Alzheimer's alone is expected to cost our country over $1 trillion by 2050. All of us as taxpayers help pay that bill, because public programs like Medicare and Medicaid cover a significant amount of the cost of care and treatment. But if we had earlier interventions and treatments that delayed the onset of these diseases, Mr. President, we would be able to reduce spending significantly. Take Alzheimer's as an example. Mr. President, does the Majority Leader want to speak? I can go back to the end of my remarks when he's finished.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I appreciate my friend from Minnesota being as courteous as she always is. I would ask unanimous consent that her statement not appear interrupted in the record.
Without objection.
I do this short unanimous consent request. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to executive session and it be in order to file cloture on executive calendars numbered 201 and 221. Further, that the mandatory quorum under Rule 22 be waived. Finally, that if this request is granted, the Senate resume legislative session after the final cloture motion is reported pursuant to this order.
Is there objection?
Yes, under Rule 22. I said Rule 20. It's under Rule 22 is how we're proceeding on this.
It's for calendar number 220, sir.
Okay, we're going to hang on, Mr. President. Let's start over, because these numbers I've read them in backward. Should have been going frontward. I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to executive session and it be in order to file cloture on executive calendars number 201, 221.
220. 220.
Oh, it says 221 here.
220.
Okay, so it's not my fault, okay? Okay, Mr. President. All right, here we go again. Be in order to file cloture on executive calendars number 201 and 220. Further, that the mandatory quorum under Rule 22 be waived. Finally, that if this request is granted, the Senate resume legislative session after the final cloture motion is reported pursuant to this order.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The Senate will proceed to executive session and the clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Justice, Byron Todd Jones of Minnesota to be Director, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I send a cloture motion to the desk. In fact, it should already be there.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Byron Todd Jones of Minnesota to be Director, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I would ask, Mr. President, that the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, before I proceed, I would just note that it's coincidental that the senator from Minnesota is on the floor, but I've heard her often speak about what a wonderful job this man has done as a U.S. attorney in the state of Minnesota, in addition to his other duties. So I'm glad she's here on the floor to understand we're moving forward on this. Mr. President, there's another matter to be reported.
The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of State, Samantha Power of Massachusetts to be the representative of the United States of America to the United Nations with the rank and status of Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary and the representative of the United States of America in the Security Council of the United Nations.
I send a cloture motion to the desk on calendar number 220.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Samantha Power of Massachusetts to be the representative of the United States of America to the United Nations with the rank and status of Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary, and the representative of the United States of America in the Security Council of the United Nations, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Mr. President, I ask again unanimous consent that reading the names be waived. Extend my appreciation again to my friend from Minnesota.
Under the previous order, the Senate will resume legislative session.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Senator
President.
from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I first want to thank the Majority Leader for his work and the members of the Senate for allowing Todd Jones to get a vote as head of the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms Bureau. This is a job that has gone unfilled, Mr. President, as you know, for 7 years since it became confirmable under law. 7 years under President Bush, under President Obama. These 24 agents have had no leader. During that time, they have investigated extensive crimes, including just this year, the Boston Marathon bombing, as well as the explosion in Texas. These are just examples of what these agents are doing. They deserve a full-time leader. Mr. Jones is a former Marine, 5 children. He's been going back and forth between Minnesota, doing the U.S. Attorney's Office job, and doing the ATF job for 2 years. Enough is enough. I'm very glad that we are moving forward with this nomination. I'm glad for Mr. Jones, who deserves this, who's been willing to put his name forward, who is willing to come in to clean up this agency after Fast and Furious and all the concerns we all had about what happened with that effort. He needs to come in, take over this very difficult job, and do 2 jobs at once. He deserves to be confirmed for this job. I'm very pleased for the agents as well, those 2,400 hardworking people that simply go to work every day, immune from the politics, immune from what Democrats think, what Republicans think. They just deserve a boss. That's what this vote is about. Now, Mr. President, I want to finish my remarks here about NIH, the National Institutes of Health, something incredibly important in my state. That's the home of the Mayo Clinic, home of University of Minnesota, where they are now undertaking the simple task of mapping the brain, and talk about what these cuts mean. I focused before on the stories of individual Minnesotans, but I've also spoke here about the cost if we don't do anything, the cost of inaction, the cost of not doing the research. Look at Alzheimer's as an example. If we were able to delay the onset of Alzheimer's by just 5 years, this is not curing it, Mr. President. This is simply delaying the onset by 5 years, similar to the effect of anti-cholesterol drugs have on preventing heart disease. We would be able to cut the government spending on Alzheimer's care by almost half in 2050, by almost half. We're talking here about billions of dollars. The answer, of course, to delay the onset of Alzheimer's by 5 years won't just drop from the sky. It needs dedicated scientists and doctors with the resources to conduct the experiments and to move forward. I've seen what they're doing with mapping the brain. I met with those scientists afterwards, and one of the first things they asked me is I asked them about the groundbreaking, the work that they did. They talked about the effect this is having on young scientists who are afraid to go in these fields, who don't know if their research is going to be funded because there's only enough money to fund the research that has been going on for years. So many innovative ideas can be lost if this continues. We all heard at lunch last week from Francis Collins, who heads up the NIH, talking about the hope and the exciting developments that are going on in combating diseases. Yet our country, what a time to step back. This is not the time to step back. This is not the time when we're on the verge of delaying the onset of Alzheimer's, of helping so many people, of saving so much money, when what we are spending on research is literally a drop in the bucket compared to the cost of the disease. Investment in NIH isn't just the right thing to do from a public health perspective, Mr. President, it also makes good economic sense. NIH generates tens of billions of dollars in new economic activity across the country each year and supports hundreds of thousands of good jobs. In 2012, NIH funding supported 8,800 jobs in my state alone. Unfortunately, federal investment in medical research has stagnated in the last decade, and as a result of sequestration, funding for NIH was slashed $1.55 billion this year alone. This cut means 700 fewer competitive research grants will be funded, and 750 fewer patients will be admitted to the NIH Clinical Center. And this reduction comes at a time when we are funding only 18% of potential projects. a record low for the second year in a row. In Minnesota, the University of Minnesota could lose $50 million of its $700 million federal research budget in the next couple of years. This drop in support not only threatens research in the short term, but could have devastating effects on innovation in the United States for many years to come. I hear from countless students and researchers who are considering leaving the field or even the country because the funding just isn't available here. If we're not going to have the funding, they're going to go and do their research in Canada or some other country. We can't allow the pipeline of future researchers to dry up or move overseas. Investing in medical research is the right thing to do. It's also the smart thing to do. And that's why support for this research is not a partisan issue in the Senate. At least it has not been up until now. I want to thank Senate Appropriations Committee Chairwoman Mikulski and Ranking Member Shelby and the Labor and Health and Human Services Subcommittee Chairman Senator Harkin and Ranking Member Moran for their strong leadership on this issue. I applaud the work they have done prioritizing NIH funding by providing $31 billion in 2014. This figure could again be cut by billions, Madam President, if we do not replace the sequester with sensible, targeted spending cuts similar to what we included in the Senate budget. So why put the money aside if we're then going to slash it because of sequester when we all know it should be replaced with more targeted spending cuts? Something that makes more sense is a mix of revenue and spending cuts as suggested by the Simpson-Bowles Commission and every other economic commission that looked at this matter. It is time to replace sequestration with something that makes sense. And cutting research that saves lives and lengthens people's lives who have Alzheimer's, that helps people that have autism, that helps people that have diabetes, this is the wrong way to go. We all agree about the importance of reining in wasteful spending and reducing the deficit, Madam President, about the need for the government to improve its fiscal discipline, but we can't do this in a way that is penny-wise and pound-foolish. Fiscal responsibility is about values and priorities just as much as it's about dollars and cents. It's about spending smarts as well as spending cuts. I strongly support the NIH and the hope it brings to people in my state and across the country. I look forward to working with my colleagues in a bipartisan fashion to replace the cuts imposed by the sequester and ensure our country maintains its leadership in medical innovation. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from